joint webinar, public reports on evaluation and tools for decisions based on regulatory trust. My name is Lucia Perez, Coordinator of Communications of FIFARMA, and I have the pleasure of being your host for this session. We're going to start with a brief description of this webinar that'll be taking place in Spanish. However, we have simultaneous interpretations in English and Portuguese for the entire session. To select your language of preference, you'll find in the bottom part of your screen an icon with the world symbol, and then we will see the 3 languages. You can choose the language of preference to hear. To improve the quality of interpretation, in case of hearing the webinar in Portuguese or English, you must choose the mute original audio. That'll be allowing you to listen only to the interpreters. This session will last around 1 hour, and we'll start with the words of welcome from the executive directors of FIFARMA and CIRS. And then FIFARMA will introduce the topic regulatory trust or the strengthening of regulatory systems. And then we will hear CIRS presenting, and as well all the results from the studies, analysis of public reports, and tools for decision-making based on regulatory trust by the regulatory authorities. After both talks, we will have around 10 minutes to receive questions from the audience. We invite you to use the questions and answers icon, also located in the bottom toolbar, for you to ask the questions in the language of preference, and we will address as many questions as we can. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Janet Yiha, Executive Director of FIFARMA, and Anna Sumuyiwa, Executive Director and Leader of CIRS. Janet is going to share her welcoming words. Thank you, Lucia. Welcome, everyone. It's a real pleasure and honor to welcome you to this important encounter, because it's not just a very relevant topic for the region, for health, but also it is the first webinar that we have in the year for FIFARMA. Well, the month of January is not over, but we managed to get together. I really thank everyone who's here. It's always incredible to see so many people from so many places in the region, but also I want to welcome very especially the Center for Innovation in Regulatory Sciences, CIRS. We've worked with them many times together, and our goal is to strengthen our systems in the region. Both organizations, I believe, all of us who are here today, and all of the organizations you represent, are aware of something that with time others have been also taking care of, which is the importance of a robust regulatory system to advance towards a better health in the region and to reach our patients in a better way in our countries. Also, want to remind you that we are working in FIFARMA on different topics. We have the conviction for promotion of access to investors and acknowledgement for intellectual property and advance in initiatives to make us a more healthy society. And we focus on 4 different areas of work: innovation ecosystems, health, and access to medications, and support to the strengthening of regulatory systems. And on this last point, which is why we're together, we are always working on the promotion of the highest standards and best regulatory practices. We're working on a world of initiatives that are aimed towards this. And in this context, and with this idea in mind, tools like the regulatory reliance are crucial. This is a strategy that not just harnesses the capacities and assessment of the authorities of reference, but also fosters international cooperation, speeds up the processes to approve medications and technologies, and optimizes the resources available. We were able to harmonize the existing standards, always focusing on the needs of the patients, in this case from our region. And this is the topic that connects us today, that gathers us today, to talk about the public reports for the assessments and these
esencial de
PARs
la
are an essential
transparencia,
tool
la
for
confianza y el
transparency,
fortalecimiento del
trust,
compliance regulatorio.
and
Esta es una
the
labor que no
strengthening of
solamente
regulatory offices.
será
This is a
alcanzable mediante la
work
colaboración
that will be
efectiva entre los
reachable
actores clave de la
through
industria de
the
la salud y las
participation of all
autoridades
the players
regulatorias,
in the
sino que
industry,
también
and
permitirá
also
responder, como también lo decía
will
de
allow us to
forma más
respond
ágil y
in a more
eficiente
agile
a las
and
necesidades
efficient
de los
way
pacientes.
to the needs
Con
of the
este
patients.
contexto en mente,
With this
los
context
invito
in
a todos a
mind,
que
I
se
would invite you
sumerjan
all
en esta conversación
to
que vamos a tener el día de hoy,
submerge in this
que
conversation,
todos
that
podamos
we can all
aprender,
delve into
aportar
it,
y de alguna manera
learn,
poder tener
contribute,
nuevas ideas para
and
avanzar
have new
hacia lo que
ideas
finalmente
towards
eventualmente es lo
what
que nos
we
convoca,
want to
marcos
convey
regulatorios
today.
más sólidos en América
Having
Latina.
more
Estoy
solid
segura, como
regulatory frameworks
siempre,
in
lo
Latin
que pasa
America.
con estos
And
webinars,
I'm always
que
sure
habrá
in these webinars
reflexiones
there
y
will be
aportes que serán
opinions
esenciales para
and
seguir avanzando.
contributions that will be
Sean todos
essential
muy, muy
to
bienvenidos.
continue
Espero que este
working.
webinar sea de gran
Welcome, and I
provecho
hope
para
this
todos.
webinar is very, very fruitful
Muchas
for everyone.
gracias, Janet, por esa cálida
Thank you, Janet,
bienvenida e
for this warm
intervención.
welcome and
Procedemos
intervention.
ahora a dar
And
el
we will now
espacio a
proceed
Ana
to give way
Somoyiwa,
to
directora
Anna
ejecutiva
Sumuyiwa,
y líder del
Executive
CIRS.
Director and leader
Adelante,
of
Ana.
CIRS.
Lucia, thank you for inviting us to share the outputs of this great piece of work. Good morning. My name is Anna Somoyiwa. I am the head of the Center for Innovation in Regulatory Science. I thank you all for choosing to spend your morning with us. So we are based in the United Kingdom mostly, but we work globally to bring together the regulators, reimbursement agencies, the industry, patients, and academia to identify and propose solutions and challenges in the development, the registration, and reimbursement of novel medicinal products. Our work is truly global, with active participation from government bodies in North, Central, and Latin America, Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. In addition, the majority of the top 20 pharmaceutical companies support our work. Our strategic pillars include performance metrics, quality of decision making, and alignment between regulatory and reimbursement requirements. Our research is guided by members of our Scientific Advisory Council, which is formed of senior representatives from all our different stakeholders who decide a plan of research for 3 years. Reliance has been and will continue to be a key theme of the research for CIRS. We have been involved in this field for a number of years. We have very much quite a lot of experience working with the regulators and the industry on the nuances of how to do reliance in a sustainable way. And we're very grateful for the opportunity to collaborate with FIFARMA on this webinar. And I'm sure that you will find the insights from this work helpful and relevant to your organizational mission. So I wish us all a great webinar. And when you do have time, please feel free to visit the CIRS website and sign up to our mailing list, as quite a lot of the work that we do is related to Reliance. And I'm going to hand over back to Lucia for the next session of the webinar. And I thank you all again for giving us your time, and Joanna and Diego for working so closely on making this webinar happen. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Ana, por su
Thank
valiosa
you very
intervención.
much, Anna, for your
Ahora procedo a
valuable
invitar a Diego
comments.
Salas,
And now I'd like to
director de
invite
Asuntos
Diego Salas,
Regulatorios de
Director of
FIFARMA,
Regulatory
quien
Affairs
presentará
for
el tema
FIFARMA, who
Confianza
will introduce the
Regulatoria, como
topic
herramienta para
regulatory
promover el fortalecimiento de
reliance
los sistemas
to
regulatorios.
strengthen
Adelante, Diego.
the regulatory
Muchas
systems.
gracias, Lucía. Muchas
Thank
gracias a
you,
nuestros
Lucia.
colegas del CIRS
Thank
y, por
you
supuesto,
to
a
our
todos
colleagues
ustedes que
from
nos acompañan.
CIRS and everyone
Es
for
importante
joining us. It's important
retomar algunos
to
conceptos sobre
revisit
el
some of
uso
the
del reliance
concepts
regulatorio
of the
previo a conocer los
regulatory
resultados de este
reliance
maravilloso
and
estudio.
knowing the
Vamos a
results of this
partir
marvelous study.
que en un contexto
And we're going to
global que
start
está marcado
talking
por
about
los
a global
avances
context
tecnológicos,
within
por los
technological
países
advancements
interconectados
in
y
our
por los
countries,
crecientes
which are
desafíos
connected,
sanitarios.
and the
Las
growing
autoridades
challenges
regulatorias
in the health
enfrentan la
sector
responsabilidad de
and
proteger
the
la salud
responsibility
pública
that we face to
mientras
protect
optimizan
public
recursos
health
y
while we
agilizan
optimize
procesos. En
resources.
este marco, el
In
reliance
this
regulatorio
framework
es una
of the
estrategia clave
regulatory Reliance, we have this key strategy to strengthen international cooperation and foster science. Reliance allows the regulatory authorities to harness the decisions that have been made and optimize their own resources and ensuring high quality standards. In Reliance, regulatory reliance and the use of these jurisdictions is not just an efficiency tool. It is a solution that promotes convergence of regulatory standards, speeding up the attention and care of essential specialists, and universal coverage in health. The regulatory authorities can dedicate more efforts to post-sales and local taxation and guaranteeing informed decisions that are based on information. The concept of regulatory reliance is not new, although its formal development globally was always intensified in the last few decades. As a principle, it can be tracked down to the 1960s when the World Health Organization introduced the Systems for Quality in International Trade of Pharmaceutical Products, better known as CTP. In 1995, the European Union invented the procedure for mutual recognition, allowing the member states to analyze the decisions made by all of the regulatory entities. From decades ago, there was an approval of mutual recognition between countries, and during the pandemic of COVID-19, Reliance played a crucial role in allowing quick decisions based on assessments of other decisions. The concept note on the regulatory principles of regulatory decisions that was adopted in the 9th conference, Pan American Conference for regulatory the regulation of the pharmaceutical industry in El Salvador, and also Annex 10 on the best practices in the use of regulatory decisions in the regulation of medical products, which was published in 2021 by the WHO, provide principles and key recommendations for the regulatory authorities to implement reliance in an effective way, respecting the sovereignty and importance of their capacities. Next, reliance must be applied to all of the functions of the life cycle, including the registry and authorization, trade during reliance as trade for the changes by registrations, licenses, and establishments, and the release of biological products and vaccines, and the fiscalization of clinical trials. While there's no single recipe or silver lining for the adoption of reliance, the World Health Organization and the Pan American Health Organization recommend the authorities to consider at least establishing a regulatory framework and legal framework that allow to facilitate the making of decisions in other directions, defining criteria for the regulatory authorities based on international standards that guarantee the equality of the regulated products or through the verification of their quality, training the technical staff in the interpretation of regulatory decisions abroad in the local context, and adopting strategies based on specific needs of each country and the health priorities of each country, promoting convergence and harmonization of international standards using tools like the Technical Document CPB in its electronic version, and participating in joint activities like shared inspections, coordinated activities, and collaboration between jurisdictions. In the context of regulatory reliance, the public reports on assessment are a tool of great value. Sharing these The authorities can trust the assessments made by any reference authorities, avoiding the duplication of efforts and the optimization of resources. With collaboration and the organization among the regulatory authorities, the publication of these documents also allows for transparency and trust in the process. The World Health Organization invites the authorities to use these reports as a key tool for information-based analysis. And ratifying our commitment towards public health in Latin America and aware of the needs to establish these standards in the region through the use of Reliance, the system financed this study based on CIRS to assess the activities of these regulatory authorities, FDA, EMA, Canada, Switzerland, Australia, and Brazil, that have the information necessary to use and to deploy these activities. So we could also, within the dossiers that were submitted for the assessment in these regions, these are critical points where we have opportunities to together build the authorities and the industry. So we're very happy to bring you all together and to have the results in Spanish language. I thank you for your participation, and we invite you to continue promoting the establishment of these regulatory systems through the use of Reliance practices as an essential pillar for health. Thank you very much, Lucia, and let's move forward. Thank you, Diego. Again, we extend our gratitude. He's the Director of Regulatory Affairs for FIFARMA. Thank you for your comments on the importance and the history and the use of regulatory reliance to better understand the results of the studies. To continue with our agenda, I would like to welcome Juan Lara, Senior Research Analyst for CIRS, who will present the results of the study analysis of public reports for assessment as a tool to guide decision-making based on regulatory trust by the regulatory authorities. Juan is a professional with experience in data analysis, quality assurance, production, research and development, and regulatory issues, focused on developing regulatory policies and improving global practices. He is a chemist, a pharmaceutical professional, and biology professional, and he has worked on the analysis of the regulatory landscape in Mexico and Central America, and he contributed to optimize the scientific decisions in regulatory affairs. Juan, go ahead. Thank you very much. Can you let me know if you can see my screen once I share it? Okay, can you see it? I would like to think I do. That you can, yes, you can see it. Thank you, Lucia. Before anything, thank you all for giving us the opportunity to introduce all this information and to get together to share the results that we've obtained from this study, as Diego said. I have to thank you all for the privilege of sharing this information and sharing these results with you, and thank the people who were part of the development of this project through our FIFARMA colleagues, as well as Magda and Mario, Alanis, Dr. Neil McCausland, and Anna Sumuyiwa, our executive director. So to start, I would like to explain what we're going to address throughout this presentation. And we're going to talk a little bit about an executive summary to have on a single slide all of the important points that we want for this meeting. And we're going to have some context of how this study developed, and also throughout the development of the study to explain the methodology that we used for this project. And we have a brief look at the results I know it could be a bit overwhelming, but we will arrive at the conclusions of the study. So, to start, the executive summary. The goal of this study was to assess, as Diego mentioned, whether the information necessary to adopt and make reliance-based decisions was present in the different reports from the reference agencies. So these corresponded to the approval of 6 new active substances in 7 regulatory authorities. And general findings, we can summarize that the public assessment reports of the PARS contain the majority of the relevant information for Reliance in the initial authorization for a new active substance, that the degree of inclusion in these reports varies between authorities and between sections of the PARS, and we'll explain a little bit about what we mean by sections. And then another finding was that no PAR includes all of the information identified as relevant according to the generic list of relevant information based or developed during the study from different sources and authorities that are currently implementing Reliance. Regarding the sections, we found or identified that there are sections with more or less inclusion of information, highlighting the clinical section, the risk benefit, and all the regulatory issues that I just mentioned, which are of the most extensive parts that take up most time for the regulatory agencies, and the less inclusion. We found that the section, the chemical and fabrication section, or CNC, and the non-clinical had less detailed information. Also worth mentioning, it is also, this information is not just found here, but it can also be found in other regulatory tools, such as the Certificate of Pharmaceutical Products, as Diego said, the same application and request that is in the dossier that is delivered to the agency, and other kinds of information in the public reports and assessments. And if we compare, we can say that the public assessment reports of EMA and FDA from the US had more detailed information compared to the other authorities. However, this doesn't mean that we, or that these are better than others, because this creates a lot about all the information that's going of the reference that's going to use this information, how they are adapted to their regulatory framework, and also with the small parenthesis that we analyzed a relatively small cohort, comparing the large amount of authorizations that we have in around, not the, around 40 new active substances per year. As a conclusion, we want to mention that in spite of the fact that none of these PARs have all the information that we could or that we use to assess these methods, we can conclude that the PARs have very useful information that can be used to make regulatory decisions. And again, I explain the potential use of these reports that will depend directly on the directives and requirements of each authority that intends to use this type of document. And lastly, as recommendations, at the end of the whole review, we believe that we should guarantee communication, clear communication between agencies and the regulated parties, creating awareness on the importance of this type of document that has to be or should be worked on according to the availability and integrity of these reports throughout the whole life cycle of the product, which are being regulated and should be identified with comparable elements between agencies to be used by agencies that intend to do reliance-based reviews. Anna, I think you've raised your hand.
Is there anything you wanted to share, Anna? Or was it just okay, well, I think ella está
I don't know if you wanted to share something, Anna.
tenía nada que, muy
But
bien.
your hand was raised anyway.
Continuando,
Moving on,
antes de entrar en el
before
estudio, lo primero que sí
going into the study,
quisiéramos explicar un poquito
the
más
first
es,
thing we would like to
qué son
explain
estos
is
informes públicos de
that
evaluación
these
y para qué se
reports,
utilizan, ¿no?
what they're for,
Pues
basically,
bueno,
and
los informes públicos de evaluación son recursos
these
públicos
reports are
que hablan acerca de los
resources
resultados
that talk
del
about
proceso de
the results
autorización de
and the
un medicamento,
authorization process of a
llámese registro
medication
sanitario,
with
licencia
its
de
own
comercialización,
sanitary
marketing
record
authorization
and or
application,
registration
para medicamentos nuevos
application
y
and
subsecuentes aprobaciones, ¿no?
subsequent
De este
approvals
medicamento, ya sea por
of these
indicaciones
medications. So
adicionales o
with
por
the
cambios
indications or changes
pasan a lo largo
that
del ciclo de vida del
happen
producto, ¿no?
throughout the
Estos
life cycle.
informes
These
incluyen un
reports include
conjunto de
a
documentos
set
regulatorios que
of
explican
documents
el cómo
that
la
explain the
autoridad
how
evalúa el
the
dossier
authorities can
y por lo
assess
general
and
incluye
therefore
también las
include
actualizaciones
the
que se hicieron
updates that
posteriormente
were
a la
made
primera
after
autorización.
the first authorization.
Esta información
This information
tiene que ser manejada de alguna
has to
manera
be handled
a fin de
to
enmascarar la información que podría ser
mask
considerada
the
confidencial
information that could be considered
para que
confidential
pueda hacerse
so
pública,
that
¿no?
it can be made
Como
public.
con algunos ejemplos
And as
de información
examples
confidencial,
of
pues puede
confidential
ser
information,
información
it could
comercialmente
be
sensible del producto,
commercially
que es
sensitive
un tema
information on the
bastante interesante
product.
también que no vamos a poder abordar en esta
We're not going to be able to
sesión.
address that topic in
La
this session,
información
but
personal
this is an
tanto de
important
los
topic.
pacientes que fueron
Personal
participantes
information
en
of
los
the
ensayos
patients
clínicos como
and
de
clinical
los
studies,
revisores que hicieron este tipo
also
de
of
evaluaciones
the
y
reviewers or the
pues
auditors who
otro
check
tipo
this
de
information,
información, ¿no? Es
and
bastante,
other type
bastante
of
extenso
information.
este
So
tema.
this is a pretty
Y
extensive
bueno, ¿para qué
topic.
se utilizaron, no? ¿Para qué se
And what
utilizaron
are
o
they used
desarrollaron?
for? Mm,
Los informes
the
se
reports
utilizan
were
principalmente
used or
como una
are
forma de
used
comunicar
as a way
transparentemente
to
cuál fue el fundamento de
transparently
la decisión
communicate
de
the
la
foundations
autoridad
of the
hacia los
decisions made
pacientes,
by the
los
authorities for the
profesionales que van a
patients
utilizar este
and the
producto
professionals that are
o
going to use
producto en
this
cuestión,
information,
o algunos
or
o algunos representantes de la industria, ¿no?
some
Estamos hablando
representatives from the
de
industry,
compañías que necesitan saber cuál fue
companies
la
that
razón
need to know the reason
por esa toma de decisión.
for that
Y
decision being
también
made.
es importante mencionar que aunque fueron
Also important to
diseñados con
mention
otro
that
propósito,
although they were designed with a
se
different
ha
purpose,
observado que algunas autoridades
some
utilizan
authorities
estos
have
documentos
been
para
observed to use these
fundamentar
documents
decisiones
to
regulatorias
make
con el
regulatory
fin de
decisions
mejorar
in
la
order to
eficiencia
improve the
regulatoria y
efficiency, regulatory efficiency,
aprobar o
and
utilizar o hacer
to
mejor
approve
uso
or
de los
make
recursos
better
limitados que se
use
tienen.
of the limited resources
Ahora,
available.
como
Now,
planteamiento del problema y como lo comentó al inicio
as
Diego,
it was mentioned by
el
Diego,
anexo 10 de buenas prácticas de
in
Reliance,
Annex 10 in the
desarrollado
best practices with Reliance,
incluido en el protocolo
that was included
55
in
del
this
Comité
report
Técnico
in the
Científico
Technical
de
Scientific
Especificaciones para
Committee
Formulaciones
for
Farmacéuticas,
Specifications for Pharmaceutical
en el anexo 10
uh,
hay un
industry.
pequeño párrafo
Annex 10 has a paragraph that
busca
seeks
sugerir o
to
alentar
suggest
a que las
uh,
agencias de referencia
or to encourage the
emitan
reference
informes
agencies
públicos de
to issue
evaluación
public
en un idioma
reports
común
or
y
assessments in a common
mientras
language,
que
while
para las agencias que utilizan este
for
tipo
the
o que
agencies that use
pretenden
this type
implementar
or
mecanismos de
intend
reliance
to
utilicen
implement
este
these
tipo de
reliance
documentos como fuente
mechanisms use
principal de
these documents as
información
the main source
para ese tipo de
of
evaluaciones.
information for this
Sin
type of
embargo,
assessment.
lo que
However,
hemos podido identificar a
and
lo
what
largo
we've
del
been able
tiempo
to
es que
identify through
tanto
time,
las autoridades
both the
como de referencia como
authorities
las que utilizan este
of
tipo de
reference
documentación
as well as the ones
enfrentan
who use this type of
desafíos en
documentation
la elaboración y
face
utilización de este
challenges
tipo de
in the use of these type of documents, and these challenges generally can be summarized in identifying and understanding the key risks and understanding the value judgments and the weighing based on context that they could have to generate the benefits, and in particular, any information related to the chemistry, manufacturing, and safeness of product as well. So it's important to understand that information.
So, based on this problem, we tried to develop a study that would have as its goal to evaluate if the information that was necessary to implement Reliance was included within the public evaluation reports. And it sounds pretty challenging considering that there's a lot of criteria to implement Reliance, and there's a lot of information available as well. So we try to divide this by specific goals, where in the first instance, we identified which information was generally required by authorities that implement Reliance, or the information that they required from the reference agencies. Then in second place, we analyzed and compared the public evaluation reports from different authorities to learn about the differences and similarities of the information that was registered in these documents. And in the third place, we evaluate if this key information that the Reliance implementing agencies required was included in the public assessment reports. And finally, we tried to determine if the public reports were enough to support decision-making in these agencies that implement Reliance. Now, continuing with the methodology, we tried to have a representative sample because we couldn't review all public assessment reports of all reference agencies. So we tried to get a sample as representative as possible. And therefore, we tried to select from a list of products that were approved between 2018, that were approved by most of the agencies between 2018 and 2021, that would have different therapeutic areas, that also showed variability in their chemical composition. So we tried to use 3 products or evaluate 3 products that were from technological synthesis or considered biological products, or 3 that were considered of chemical synthesis. And we also tried to do the sample as representative as possible. That would also include several products that would have a special assignment, like an orphan medication, or that would have been through a process. How do we call this in Spanish? A facilitated regulatory process, or an accelerated process, like an accelerated authorization. And then at the end, we obtained these 6 products as a result, and they became 33 public evaluation reports. This presentation, I'm not going to delve into it. It's basically just a table of the public reports that we assessed. But what I would like to mention is that we tried to assess 7 agencies: FDA, EMA, Health Canada, Anvisa, and MHRA, and Swissmedic. But in this study, we're only going to show the results of the first 6 because we did not have enough information on MHRA. This is just a disclaimer that I wanted to make. Now, the main stages of the study can be summarized in 3 stages. The first one was identifying the information that the Reliance implementing authorities need from the reference agencies. Then there was a consolidation stage of this key information. And then finally, We used this list of key information for the Reliance implementing agencies, and we compared it with the information that was described in the public assessment reports. Now, for stage 1, the way in which we determined what information was the one that the Reliance implementing agencies were looking for was through a query of references that are publicly available on the web that included information from Singapore, Australia, Brazil, both for biologicals as well as chemical synthesis, Saudi Arabia, Malaysia, recommendations of the WHO, information derived from our reports that we've done ourselves, and information derived from previous interactions that we've had with several authorities. It is important to mention here, and I'd like to emphasize on this, that given that each authority has different requirements or criteria to implement Reliance, we try to consolidate one single list, a generic list, that wasn't specific to any authority for the information that they require in order to have a more broader context. Now, in the second stage, we try to consolidate this information in different sections, and we reached the conclusion that 5 sections were necessary. The first one that would talk about the regulatory history, the second about the CMC, the third one about the non-clinical aspect, the fourth would be the clinical aspects, and fifth would be the risk versus benefit analysis that was done on the product that was evaluated. As I was telling you, the list of key information doesn't have the goal of establishing what information must be included in these reports, but it's the information that may be sought by the authorities generally to carry out their Reliance processes. Now, going with stage 3, which was the comparison of information of this key information with the information described in the public assessment reports, the comparison was done through a categorization of information. So, following this flowchart, each subtopic that was described in the key information list was assessed or compared with or against or on par with the information that was described in the public assessment report. So, for example, for a specific subtopic described in the section of regulatory history, we first ask ourselves if the document or the report contained any information related to this subject matter. If the answer was yes, if we considered that the answer to this question was yes, we tried to identify how much information was described. And so if we identified that all the information on this subtopic was described in this specific public assessment report, we would classify it as all the details described. And if this information was described partially, we would categorize it as some details described, and if it only contained maybe just a synopsis in a paragraph, we would only consider it as such. So, if it was not available, first we would ask ourselves if this subtopic specifically was applicable to the assessment report that we were evaluating, because we have to consider that if the list of key information requests or seeks information on, for example, orphan medications, and we are evaluating reports on Health Canada, this information is not going to be available and it will not apply because Health Canada doesn't have a policy for approval for orphan medications as we can find in other regulatory agencies. So keeping this in mind, we were able to categorize the information described in the PARs in 5 degrees of inclusion of information, as described in this flowchart. And the results, we gave a score to each one of these categories. We added up the results per topic. Here, we have to clarify that if a specific topic had more than one subtopic, we were going to add this information there. And as a result, well, before we get to the results, I'd like to mention that the documents or the public reports, public assessment reports, vary a lot in format, but they don't only vary in format, but they are not unique documents. You're not going to find one single PDF in every case that describes the public assessment report. They could be different documents. For example, in FDA, the approval package is constituted by at least 8 different documents, and that some of these are going to vary depending on the agency that you're trying to learn the information on. I just wanted to mention that so that you don't leave with an idea that there's one single document. Then, as a result, the results were grouped into a general summary per authority, in a summary per sections, and in a detailed analysis per sections. We will only focus right now, because of time, in the general summary and the sections summary, and we'll try to give a few examples of each one of the topics that were assessed. So, if we were to group all categorizations that we did of all the public assessment reports and we were to divide them per agency, we would obtain this diagram. And as we can see, this diagram describes the distribution of the inclusion degrees of the information that was described in the public assessment reports. And we can see basically that if we consider the 3 categories that include information, most of the information required to implement Reliance was described in all the public assessment reports that were evaluated of all the authorities.
Si ahora bien dividiéramos o seccionáramos esto por
if we were to divide this per section, and we try to compare it for each one of these authorities, we would obtain this kind of diagram where, without trying to go deeper into the numbers and only by looking at the colors, we can see that for the part of the clinical section and the analysis of risk versus benefit, as well as the regulatory history section, these are the sections that contain or where we can see predominantly the green and blue colors. So we can conclude that most of the information that we evaluated was described in these documents, right? For all agencies, it's important to mention. And here we can see a deep dive for the section for regulatory history. And I'd only like to just give an example of how this should be read. Here we can see, for example, that for the list of steps taken in the regulatory process, we can observe that all public assessment reports of the EMA described all the details of this topic, and so on for all agencies or for all public assessment reports of all agencies. For example, for the section of regulatory history, we can see also that all information on the final decision of the authorities were described in all the public assessment reports of all authorities. Also, for example, in the section of CMC, we could see that there's descriptions that are very detailed in all the public assessment reports of all the agencies on the conditions for transport and storage of the product. It can also be of interest for the agency that tries to implement Reliance in medication authorization. For example, for non-clinical studies, we can see that all public assessment reports of all the authorities described in great detail the description, or they would describe the results, the general results of the non-clinical results carried out in the study of the product. And also for the clinical part, which was one of the most detailed parts, we can also see that most of the public assessment reports of all agencies contained information on clinical studies. And that I would invite everyone here to go and look per subtopic which information was described, as could be the list of studies carried out or the description of the purpose of each study. Now, the same applies for the risk-benefit analysis. Here, it's important also to take into consideration that in most agencies, the information was described in great detail. And as a conclusion, and to hand the floor to the Q&A session, we can conclude that, first of all, we did this study trying to assess if the information that was necessary to implement Reliance was described in these documents. We can also conclude that since each authority has different Reliance requirements, we had to develop a generic list, and that when using this generic list and comparing it to the information of 33 public assessment reports, we concluded that most of the information is relevant for Reliance and is described in these documents, and that the degree of inclusion varies interagency and intersections, and that no public assessment report contained all of the relevant information based on this list that we developed, which is general, and that includes all the criteria that we could gather. And then finally, that the clinical evaluation sections, risk, benefit, and regulatory agencies history were the ones that had greater detail, and that the CMCs and non-clinical were the ones that had less detail, and that also it's important to mention that this information can not only be found in these types of documents, but can also be found in other types of regulatory tools like the CPP, the information described in the dossier, or additional information provided by the requesting party. And with this, I would like to thank everyone for the opportunity and the space to explain this study, and I look forward to your questions. I will try to answer them as much as possible, and I am leaving here. I have it's a pleasure for me to be able to share with you that we've done the translation of this study into Spanish, and that we are sharing in your screen the QR code so you can download the study. Thank you so much for your attention.
Muchas gracias, Juan, por tu destacada presentación sobre el tema en referencia.
Thank you so much, Juan, for your detailed presentation, which was key to generate reflections and give us a reference. Now we have time for Q&A from our attendees, and we invite you to state them in the language of your preference in the Q&A box that you will find at the bottom left of your screen. This Q&A session will be moderated by Mr. Leonardo Semprú, leader of global regulatory policies for Latin America in MSC and co-president of the work group on regulatory matters for FIFARMA.
Muchas gracias, Juan, por
Thank you so much, Juan, for this excellent presentation, brilliant presentation. Now we open the floor for Q&A. I think it's a perfect moment to use the available chat to just clarify any questions that anybody might have. We have a few questions that have been sent over through the chat box or the Q&A box, and it's important that we would like to look at with you. One is related to the alignments or the alignment that is happening internationally to establish guidelines that promote Reliance. And the question is, if you have knowledge of the fact that any international organizations like ICH are trying to establish this kind of guideline, and if the public assessment reports have a direct relevance in the approval of the molecules that are going to subsequently come in. I don't know if you'd like to comment about this. Yes, well, as far as we know, there hasn't been a work group that tries to align what information needs to be described in the public assessment reports. It's an excellent idea, actually, because that could help the agencies really identify much easily what information, where is the information that they need to verify. This would be addressing the first question. Could you remind me the second part of the question? The second part of the question is related to the direct relevance that the public assessment reports have in the assessment or evaluation of molecules. Well, the relevance is directly related to how many modifications have been done on the regulatory framework of the agency. I could say that for some agencies, it's very relevant. The information described in the public assessment reports. A case that comes to mind is the case of Malaysia. It really uses the information described in the public assessment reports, but this will depend a lot on how much awareness the agency has on these types of documents and how much information we want to obtain from them. Excellent, Juan. I think here we also would like to add a bit on the knowledge that we have on the international initiatives, where probably to be able to achieve this harmonization, it's important for the agencies to keep participating in different initiatives. We've seen, for example, a lot of workshops that have been organized by CIRS or other types of workshops that are international and practical conferences on these regulatory matters. And I think this could be very useful to work jointly and maybe look at the development of common maybe frameworks that are related to the development of these public assessment reports. I'm now going to go to the next question. We have another question that says the following. I'd like to know if the data identified as necessary in the public assessment report for Reliance are found in a document that has been published by CIRS. And I'd also like to understand which were the authorities that were consulted to provide this list, and if the industry was also consulted. In this first stage, well, all the information that I've mentioned on the list of key information is described in the report that is already in Spanish. So I invite you all to take a look at it. And here we have the detailed list of all these subtopics that we were able to identify. And this identification was done based on the information that is public, that was described in agencies that we knew that implemented Reliance. Going back to the first stage of the slide where I described the first stage, we consulted Singapore, the documents of DGA, Anvisa, Malaysia, and we also tried to include certain criteria that were described in workshops, as well as in interactions with agencies. There wasn't any survey carried out
Pero sin
on
duda
all the possible perspectives, but undoubtedly, this is something that we should also work on
muy variable.
because it's very variable. The implementation of Reliance is very variable, and it would be interesting to learn what is more predominant. Where are the good practices in these types of requests?
Excelente, Juan. Vamos a
Excellent,
mover otra
Juan.
pregunta. Esta
Let's go
pregunta
to another question, and this question is related to Anvisa.
información que tiene una pregunta
It's
que tiene que ver
information
con
or a question that's related to the publication
pública, ¿no?
of the public assessment reports.
Discutido, ¿no? Que quizás
We had discussed this in the preparation of the workshop. Maybe regulatory agencies in this journey of evolving their level of maturity, adapting to these requirements. Currently, Anvisa doesn't publish the public assessment report in the case of all the products, only for a minority. Considering this, was this information considered for the survey? If this is the case, can you tell us if somehow there's any key information on the results or anything that has been impacted by this publication? And the other thing is if you have knowledge on other regulatory authorities that participated in the study, if you're publishing the public assessment reports in the case of all registered products. Well, considering the new publication, I don't have any knowledge on the time, but I do remember when we did this, and what I can tell you is that Anvisa has evolved a lot, very quickly in the past few years, and therefore maybe the results of this study aren't as updated as what we could see. Anvisa has worked really hard on Reliance and in making the decisions that it makes transparent. So it would be interesting to be able to carry out the study again because we tried to consider more agencies. So since each agency is in different time in evolution, we try to be able to find them in the same space, but we could have maybe lost missed this detail. It could be interesting to look at. Excellent, Juan. And maybe we could also comment here that these public assessment reports have information and they were developed to have useful information to report on regulatory decisions in the case of the agencies that currently share this information. In their beginnings, this wasn't created with a harmonized framework because the concept of reliance is a concept that is more recent, where this documentation has a fundamental importance, together with a dossier and other information that's presented, depending on the levels within each regulatory authority. So I think it's interesting to connect this question with the previous question of the important efforts, where maybe in the future we can see in regards to the possibility of having greater harmonization, greater clarity in how we compare one agency to another in terms of the information that is shared. I also think to add onto this, they were asking if there were any other agencies, right, publishing public assessment reports, at least. What we have knowledge on in Latin America, only Anvisa does this, which is important because it gives us like a North Star of how CMC is being assessed and how they are focusing derived on the climate areas, which are different to the reference agencies. So keeping this in mind, but also in Asia, there are publications of public assessment reports, for example, for PMDA. PMDA also does these types of studies. They are in Japanese and in English, but this information also exists for Asia. And they're also asking me when we talk about the experience of including the request of public information, in this case in the regulations, we also have knowledge on how, if it's recommended or not? What could you tell us from the perspective of from the assessment of the study and maybe other work that you have developed? Is it recommendable or recommended to include this information or not? How are you looking at this? Well, this is an excellent question. I think it's a bit controversial, if I could call it this way. I'd like to learn about the opinion of Magda. I am going to give my own based on the experience that we have in this study and based on the experience that I've gained in the past few years. I don't think it's prudent to put this as a requirement, as a textual requirement within a checklist, to call it as such, as happened with the case of the pharmaceutical product certificates. Because if this isn't together with the context that because the purpose is to understand the context that we based our decision on in the reference agency, and we only use this as one more requirement, I wouldn't agree. What I would agree more on is that the agencies that want to use this information have a bit more, or we should try together to come to a broader understanding of how each one of the agencies carries out its assessment, and that based on this understanding, we should feel peace of mind knowing that the information that was evaluated and presented was completely reviewed by other agencies and that we are going to use the results of all of this work. That is what I would put to consideration more than a requirement, but also what could be important, and as Diego mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, is that the regulatory framework should include or should have a concept that these types of documents exist and that they are super interesting to be able to improve the efficiency of an agency with limited resources, to be able to improve the time of deployment of medications that are necessary for the population of the country. That is what I would give as an opinion.
I don't know if you're able to hand over to my colleagues, but if not, I'll just send the information. Yes, thank you, Juan and Leonardo, for your comments. Unfortunately, we ran out of time for the Q&A session, but we would like to thank all of you who were here, and also to thank the over 350 attendees that joined us today. And hopefully it was a very enriching session and of great value to you all. So soon we'll have the recordings available in Spanish, English, and Portuguese, as well as shared material, so you can have access to all the information and presentations. And before you go, please have a look at the QR codes and follow the social networks of the two organizations so that you can keep up to date with the relevant events. So thank you for your interest and commitment and the interest in working together to strengthen the regulatory systems in the region. And until next time, thank you.